Hey, what's going on YouTube? On my gameplay video of the GTX 1080s and SLI, I received a lot of critical comments about how my frames per second were too low compared to what other reviewers were getting. I will preface the following Discord by saying that I am not above criticism, nor are my conclusions on any matter irrefutable. I'll explain the reasons why my benchmarks are more accurate and representative of what you can expect from the GTX 1080s and SLI compared to benchmarks from other reviewers, but first I'll address a series of comments suggesting that my CPU is bottlenecking my GPU's performance. For any expensive hobby that allows a lot of customization, whether it's PC building, AR-15 assembly, Magic the Gathering, or even modding cars, they all have in common strongly opinionated, obnoxious, and vocal enthusiasts that talk out of their asses. It's not every enthusiast. I would even wager that most commenters are sensible and knowledgeable, but enough commenters brigade video comment sections and website forums that reviewers and developers have started catering their content to prevent brigading. A series of brigading commenters on my videos are thoroughly convinced that my i7-4930K clocked to 4.5 GHz is bottlenecking my GPU's performance. Bottlenecking in a nutshell is when one of your hardware components' relative performance is lacking, preventing other hardware components from running to their full potential. CPU bottlenecking is most easily diagnosed when you have nearly full CPU load capacity and comparatively low GPU usage. My i7-4930K, while being 2 generations behind Skylake, is still a computing powerhouse, as it is the Ivy Bridge Extreme with its hyper-threaded 6 cores superseding the baseline 4 cores. I'll put my money where my mouth is and show real-time benchmarking using the in-game benchmark for the division. In-game benchmark tools are good for comparing different hardware because it's replicable for GPU and CPU usage, but it's not representative of actual gameplay. You are guaranteed to get much lower frames per second fighting against waves of level 34 enemies in the dark zone while calling in an extraction with your team, as I showed in my earlier benchmark video. As you saw when I showed the graphic settings for this video, I'm using a custom Ultra, which is far more intensive than the Ultra preset many reviewers are basing their benchmark numbers on, because the Ultra has Nvidia GameWorks features like HFTS and HBAO Plus disabled to give AMD cards a fair comparison. The only options I have disabled are some aesthetics like vignetting, and SMAA is only at 1 times because anti-aliasing is linked to FXAA rather than super sampling, and increasing its value would only blur the textures more than reducing the jagged edges around geometry. I have MSI Afterburners Riva Statistics hardware monitor as an overlay, and you can see my GPU and CPU clock speeds, temperatures, and usage. All in all, I had an average CPU usage of 45% and GPU usage of 95%, which is hardly indicative of bottlenecking. But to further enforce my conclusion, I downclocked my CPU to 4.1 GHz to see if there were any differences in frame rates.
Put all your lead in him! Don't ease up on him. Open wide! Whoa! Go back down!
And skipping over to the end of the benchmark run, you can see both CPU usage and FPS have negligible differences, showing that CPU power is less relevant than many of the former video's commenters thought. But don't just take my word for it. Let's look at hard data from a reputable review site, AnandTech, which shows many generations of CPUs in their gaming FPS, keeping other components the same. At most, you see a 2% difference in frame rates for the same GPU, and going from Ivy Bridge to Skylake, a whole 3 generations of CPU architecture. Sandy Bridge has finally begun struggling a little, but anyone with an Ivy Bridge CPU shouldn't have to worry about CPU bottlenecking in games for at least one more GPU architecture generation. The price to performance trend still points toward CPU generational upgrades as only netting marginal FPS gains, if at all. But let's get back to the original question of why my FPS in the games I played are so low compared to what other reviewers have been getting. One reason already mentioned above is the settings. Most reviewers are using Ultra presets. Custom settings often have features like AMD's TressFX Hair for Tomb Raider, which by itself kills Nvidia GPU FPS by 20 to 30%, or Nvidia GameWorks featured for The Division and Assassin's Creed Syndicate. These settings lower FPS across the board, and the various review sites not specifying or showing the usage of these settings lends me to believe that most testing was not done with these settings enabled, leading to inflated benchmark results compared to the more graphically intensive custom setting. Another reason is the testing methodology. Very seldomly do you actually see the gameplay video accompanying the results of benchmarking. If a built-in benchmark utility is included, that is most often used, but for games without a built-in benchmark utility, how are they making sure they are replicating the benchmark runs pixel to pixel across GPUs to ensure valid results? Instead of just giving an average and low FPS for my benchmarks and calling it a day, I actually show the diverse segments of the games and the resulting FPS, which I feel is far more useful than just averages, because there is no one average that can represent all of the different sections of the division. The game has way too many diverse segments. Finally, my benchmarking philosophy is different from that of most other reviewers. I believe that hardware performance should be based on the most graphically intensive areas of the game instead of the comparatively light load of built-in benchmark tools. Just because you can get 100 FPS average using the benchmarking tool doesn't mean you won't struggle with getting 60 FPS during intense firefights. For other considerations, would I get improved FPS if I had been using an i7 6700K or a high bandwidth SLI bridge? Possibly, but not enough to justify the cost of an entire new motherboard and RAM, DDR4 in this case, in addition to the CPU. The high bandwidth SLI bridge would be beneficial at extreme resolutions like 4K. I do have a triple monitor display at 5760 by 1080 resolution that I will use to test the high bandwidth SLI bridge. Thank you for watching this video. For my critic's satisfaction, I hope I was able to sufficiently justify my conclusions on hardware performance. Remember to leave a video rating and a comment. My name is David, and I will see you next video.